Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this class, which is going to be looking at the different views of, you could say, the Geula or the redemption that we see in books from Shivat Zion, from the Return to Zion. So what do I mean by the Return to Zion? What do I mean by the Return to Zion is the period when the Judeans, the Jews at this point, we can call them Jews, not just Israelites, the Jews return to mainly Judea to settle the land and also to rebuild the temple. What books are we going to be looking at? Let's start actually with looking at a timeline to kind of put us into the context of what we're talking about here in general. I'm going to put this up on my screen and share it. In fact, let me add here a line here, I believe it was 701, Siege of Jerusalem. Jerusalem by Sanherib. Okay. So so just to kind of go back, right? We're talking about BCE, so we're all talking about kind of negative numbers, right? So 720 BCE is when the northern kingdom falls. 701, that's the siege of Jerusalem by Sanherib. And not just the siege of Jerusalem, we think of it as, oh, Jerusalem is saved, everything's wonderful. No, the whole land of Judea is kind of devastated. It's really horrendous, and Yeshayahu talks about this. The book of Isaiah talks about this because the first half of the book of Isaiah is really placed in this period, right around kind of 700, when the big enemy is Assyria. Okay, then when we get to 586 is the destruction, right? The fall of the temple and Jerusalem, and then it's not as long as we usually think, right? It's about, let's say, 50 years, and there you have the conquest of Babylonia by Cyrus, and then the Edict of Cyrus granting permission to return. And this is when we really talk about the return to Zion, right? When Koresh says, okay, now you can come back. We're going to look at that in just a second, okay? And this is when everyone comes back, well, not everyone, a group of Jews from Babylonia come back. Certainly a portion of the Jews do return. And this is what we read about. And here in this timeline, I have kind of the different books that are focusing on different times, right? So we already see the Edict of Cyrus mentioned in Divrei Hayamim, the very end of Divrei Hayamim. We're going to look at that, right? Second Chronicles, and in the beginning of Ezra, and the first generation of Jews returning, that we really read about in Ezra. But what we read about in our prophets that we talk about, of the prophets of the return to Zion, Haggai and Zechariah, are really the ones who urge them to build the temple in the time of Darius, of Darius. Okay, so we have the whole rule of Cyrus. They're not building the temple. They kind of start and they kind of stop, and then it doesn't get picked up again until considerably later. If we look at the time, just so you understand the time frame, okay, we're looking at the Edict of Cyrus is in 538. They rebuild the temple in 520 to 518. So about 18 years later, actually, they start rebuilding the temple seriously. And once they do, they start 520 to 518. They finish in 4 years, which is tremendous. And then we read about that in Haggai and Zechariah, beginning of Ezra. And then if we kind of move forward to Nehemiah, who's in the late 440s, significantly later under the rule of Artaxerxes, he's the one who actually rebuilds the walls of Jerusalem. Now, why am I pointing all these things out? Because we're going to see different attitudes to what is the importance of these things. So, for example, how important is it for Jerusalem to have walls? And this is an importance. It's not just a political importance. We're talking about, once we're talking in Shivat Zion, people are seeing this in the framework of this. What is the redemption? What is the Geula? What were we promised? And is this it? Right? And what we're going to see is there are certain assumptions of, yes, this is it. This is it. So if this is it, then what does that mean about the things that are missing? And there are different attitudes of, like, well, the things that are missing must come, right? Or no, you know what? It's all right. It's okay. It's okay that Jerusalem has no walls, right? God will be the walls, right? So we're going to be looking at these different attitudes. So let's start. Let's actually kind of jump in with looking at the beginning of it all. Let's look at Cyrus. But before we do, I do want to say something about the books that we're going to be studying. Okay, so Haggai and Zechariah are very easy to place in terms of the chronology that I just showed you. They kind of place themselves in that chronology. Ezra, the book of Ezra, actually mentions them as the ones who kind of encouraged and got the temple built. So they're very much rooted in that historical place. Ezra and Nehemiah, the book of Ezra and Nehemiah is pretty easy. When Ezra actually served is a little bit tricky. We'll talk about that later. Certainly he's in Shivat Zion, but there actually there is an approach that sees him as later than Nehemiah. They're both under an Artaxerxes, but there were 3 Artaxerxes. So some see Ezra as a later Artaxerxes. I'll explain why when we get into these books a little bit more. Yeshayahu is an issue, okay, and I know it's an issue, okay. There is in biblical scholarship, it is very standard to talk about a first Isaiah and a second Isaiah, right? Where first Isaiah is prophesying in the time of around the time of Sanherib, the time of the Assyrian. There are several kings that he mentions, several Judean kings he mentions. He's dealing with the Assyrian kings, and that's who he talks about. He talks about Assyria. And then we get to Perek Mem, chapter 40, and he mentions, and it's Nachamu, Nachamu Ami, right? My nation should take comfort, talking about they're going to return now. And remember, there hasn't been a Judean exile in the time of Isaiah. Not quite true. I have to correct myself. There absolutely were Jews exiled in the time of Yeshayahu. We have a whole wall. If you go to the Israel Museum, if you go to the British Museum, you can see the original. If you go to the Israel Museum, you can see the replica of the Lachish inscriptions and drawing. You can see the Judeans being exiled from Lachish, right? The Lachish conquest happened under the Assyrians. They absolutely took Jews into exile. However, Perek Mem Daled and Mem Hey in chapters 44 and 45, Yeshayahu, Isaiah actually mentions Koresh by name, right? Talking about him as the anointed of God who's going to lead this whole process of redemption, right? So it absolutely seems like from chapter 40 on, we were talking about a different time period. There are other indicators, and if there's a switch in themes, when there's a switch in themes, I don't usually say, oh, it's got to be a different book, because there are plenty of books that have switches in themes, but it also has a switch in a whole historical context. Everything is talking about is different. If you don't want to say, okay, this was a different person in a different time period, you can say it was Yeshayahu prophesying far forward. Let's take a look at Yeshayahu. Here we are. So what does Yeshayahu say? He says, he's talking about that God is returning the people to Jerusalem, right? He says, "Mekim dvar avdo." He keeps the word of his servant. Vatzat malachav yashlim. He's going to fulfill his messengers' sayings, right? Messengers being the prophets. Haomer liYerushalayim tushav ulrei Yehuda tipanena v'charvata akomem, right? Jerusalem will be settled, the cities of Judah will be built, and its ruins will be set up again. Now you can understand that if you're talking about the time of regular Yeshayahu, this doesn't make sense, because Jerusalem actually comes out relatively unscathed from their siege in 701, right? It's not in ruins at all. Ha'omer latzulach haravi v'chnaratai chovish ha'omar l'Koresh ro'i, who says to Koresh my servant, v'chol chatzi yashlim v'leimor liYerushalayim tiyabana v'hechal tivased, right? He's going to do everything that I desire, says God, and to speak to Jerusalem. Jerusalem shall be built, and the temple will be established, right? Kohamar Hashem limshicho leKoresh, asher hachzakti b'yamino. So says God to his anointed Koresh, right? That I held his right hand. Okay. Now, why are there are these tremendous hopes from Koresh. Well, first of all, Koresh, in fact, lets us return. Let's take a look at that, okay, for a second. Well, before we do that, let's just say, so this is clearly what you have if you're reading through Yeshayahu, and I'll tell you the truth. In here, I am kind of biased here because I had the experience of reading through Yeshayahu. I had a class where it was called Bikiyut Nach, where you just read through all of Nach in a year, and it's it's a lot, and so you're just reading a lot. You're just going through a lot of many chapters a day, and going through Yeshayahu, going through Isaiah, all of a sudden I could understand what it meant. I get to chapter 40, I get to Parak Mem, and it's like, whoa, I know what this means. I don't have to look up. I know the language changes. I could feel the language changing. And in fact, that's what scholars say. The scholars say that from Yeshayahu Mem, from Isaiah 40, the language has later Hebrew indicators. So it's but certainly the historical context is different. And the only way to look at it is like, so you can absolutely say, okay, well, this is prophecy. Okay, that's fine. And in fact, let's take a look at what Ibn Ezra says quickly, because Ibn Ezra likes to be cryptic. And he actually quotes Rav Moshe Cohen, Rav Moshe Cohen Itikatila, I believe, who says this is about Beit Sheni. This is about the Second Temple period. This is the second part of the book of Yeshayahu refers to the Second Temple period, right? And then he says, al He says, I think everything's about the future. Everything's about us living in the later galut, in the later exile, right? But it puts in things to remind us of the exile of Babylonia that was ended by Koresh. Exile of Babylon that was ended by Koresh. Okay. However, he does do his typical Ibn Ezra thing where he says, V'daki matikei mitzvot zal amru ki sefer Shmuel katavo Shmuel v'hu emet ad vayamot Shmuel. He says, you should just know the Chazal, those who wrote down the mitzvot, who wrote down the commandments, they said Sefer Shmuel, the book of Shmuel, was written by Shmuel until it says, and Shmuel died. Right? Mm-hmm. So you should know that you can have a book that's by someone's name, and he didn't have to write the whole thing, right? But he says, here he says, the smart person will get what I'm trying to say, right? And here also, Melachim Yiru V'kam. Can I open the text? This is annoying because it doesn't open the text back to it. He says, He says, I already hinted to you the secret of this half of the book. And he says, and according to most people, that it's just talking about kings that are similar to Koresh will rise and worship. So the problem is with Ibn Ezra is it's sometimes hard to know what secret exactly he's referring to, right? He has lots of secrets. I don't think that he's actually saying here that it's necessarily written by a different person. But in the earlier reference, it did seem that when he was saying, hey, you know what Chazal said about the book of Shmuel, that the whole thing wasn't written by Shmuel. It was only written up by Shmuel up to the point where it says Shmuel died. And then someone else wrote it. Who wrote it? Who knows, right? So I think that he sees in this verse also a reference to something beyond Yeshayahu's time, but doesn't seem to think. But he also seems to say, "Hey, it's prophecy." So it could be he's talking about Koresh prophetically. And there's another place where he absolutely disagrees with Rav Moshe Cohen Chikatila, where he says, "I don't agree with him here." He says, "No, this isn't talking about Galut Babel. I'm telling you, it's talking about us. It's a prophecy about us." So it's not super clear what Ibn Ezra means. It's very possible, though, that he also split Yeshayahu into two halves and said the second half is about a different period that Yeshayahu did not live to see. Okay? At any rate, because Yeshayahu speaks explicitly about Koresh, speaks explicitly about this period, and speaks explicitly of what to explain, I can't teach a class without referring to these verses when I'm talking about what in Shivat Zion, what were the issues and what were their different views of what should be in this redemption. What's really a redemption, right? I'm going to pause for questions because I'm about to delve into Cyrus. Someone said, I saw in passing that Ibn Ezra made a reference to the Orthodox, who then were the non-Orthodox. I think that's a translation of Rabbim. So Ibn Ezra will frequently say, I think such and such, but Harabim, the most people say X, right? Like I have a different opinion and I'm going to hint to you, but most people say this thing. Most people say that this is talking about, the future. And that was translated there as the Orthodox because someone wanted to explain what he meant by that. Let's see why Cyrus was such a big deal in terms of the Jews of Shivat Zion. Let's look at the beginning of Ezra, of the book of Ezra. The book of Ezra quotes a declaration by Cyrus. Uv'shnat achad l'koresh, ובשנת אחת לקורש מלך פרס לכלות דבר אדוני מפי ירמיה, העיר אדוני את רוח קורש מלך פרץ, ויעבר קול בכל מלכותו וגם במכתב לאמור. So the first year of Koresh Cyrus goes up to the throne, and this is what he does. He issues a proclamation, which is because of God. Why? Lichlot dvar Hashem mipi Yirmiyah. In order to complete the word of God from the mouth of Yirmiyahu. What word of God is this? I should have it open. Yes, I do. In Yirmiyahu Chaf Hey in Jeremiah 25, it says, here we are. Here we are. What does it say? Vaytat kol haaretz hazot lekorba leshama vavdu hagoyim ha'ele et melech Bavel 70 shana. This entire land is going to be desolate and a waste, and the nations will serve the king of Babylon 70 years. Vayakim lot 70 shana efkot amelech Bavel v'al hagoy hahu numashem et avonam ve'el eretz kasdim v'samti oto lishmeot olam. When those 70 years are up, I'm going to pay back the king of Babylon. Okay, now let's take a look. So let's take a look at our timeline. Here we are. Okay, so if we talk about 70 years, let's look again at our timeline. So in fact, the destruction of exiles in 586 and the Edict of Cyrus is in 538. That's more like 50 years, less than 50 years. Okay, so we're actually not at 70 years, but hey, the conquest of Babylon was already in 539. So this seems to be what God promised, right? When do we get to actually the 70 years? And this is kind of interesting. The 70 years is actually closer kind of to the rebuilding of the temple, right? And one of the theories is that the reason Haggai and Zechariah were like, hey guys, you got to build the temple, you can't wait any longer, was because they saw the 70 years coming to an end. And they were like, this is the time. And that's why there was a tremendous amount. There was the determination specifically during the reign of Darius to get this done. Just an interesting point, because the question is because they had time before then and they didn't do it. Let's go back to our text. Okay, so the promise of 70 years is now being fulfilled by God through Cyrus. So if we go back to Ezra, all right, so he issues this proclamation, and what does the proclamation say? It says, Kol Mar Koresh Melech Paras, Kol Mamlechot Haaretz Natan li Adonai Elohei Hashamayim, V'hu pakad alai libnot lo bayit b'Yushalayim asher b'Yehuda. So says Koresh, the king of Paras, all the kingdom of the earth, the Lord God of heaven gave me. That construction, Hashem Elokei Hashamayim, is something we see in Persian, specifically in Persian text. And he appointed me to build him a house in Jerusalem that is in Yehuda. Okay, remember what it said in Yeshayahu, right? he will rebuild Jerusalem and the temple. He will say, let the temple be found again. He won't build it himself, but he will say, let it be built. Okay. So if we go back to the letter quoted in Ezra, okay, he's charged me with building him a house. Mi v'chem mikol amo yihi elokav imo vayal. This is where, by the way, Divrei Hayamim stops. So it says, who of you from all his nation, God will be with him, and he shall go up. This piece of Ezra is essentially quoted, not quoted, but brought in the end of Divrei Hayamim, in the end of Second Chronicles, right? As the way our Tanakh ends, right? Because our Tanakh ends with Divrei Hayamim, with Chronicles, and it ends with let him go up. This is the ending. This is the fulfillment. This is everyone coming back. The point is for everyone to come back to the land of Israel after the exile. In the world of Divrei Hayamim, of Chronicles, it brings in the idea from Vayikra that if you don't keep Shemitah, right, the land has to fulfill its Shmitot, has to have its time back. And after that happens, Cyrus comes to power, he conquers Babylon, and he says, everyone come back and go up. And that's the end, right? But in Ezra, we have a slightly longer letter. They should go up, and they should go up to Jerusalem, which is in Yehudah. Vayiven et Bet Hashem Elokei Yisrael, hu Elokim Asher B'Yerushalayim. He should build the house of the Lord God of Israel. That is the God who is in Jerusalem. That's more of a Persian kind of approach. Hey, build the temple in Jerusalem because that's the God in Jerusalem. Right? So, and in fact, while there was an early approach that said, I think it would have to be very early because they found the Cyrus cylinder relatively early on, that said, oh, hey, this is made up. Cyrus never did a proclamation like this. They just made up. Cyrus let them go back, but they made up this proclamation. And then, but the Cyrus cylinder was discovered, and it's got a very similar proclamation, a very similar letter to the people of Babylon, of Babylonia, right? So I'm just going to repeat that just because sometimes I come across this, that someone thinks the Cyrus cylinder was written to Jews. The Cyrus cylinder is like our letter. It's not. It isn't. Okay. It is. This is a picture of the Cyrus cylinder from the British Museum. Look how nice that nicely written cuneiform Akkadian. And the translation, if we look at it, I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's pretty long, right? The titles are not from the cylinder. These titles are just what the person who did this is giving it to make it easier to read. But he says, Marduk, the great Lord. Who is Marduk? Marduk's the god of Babylon, right? So he in this cylinder is saying, oh, hey, I'm doing this because of your god Marduk. He's saying to the Babylonians, your last king was stopped. He didn't do anything for Marduk. I'm doing stuff for Marduk, right? He says, Marduk, the great Lord, established as his fate for me a magnanimous heart of one who loves Babylon, and I daily attended to his worship. So my vast army marched into Babylon in peace, as armies so frequently do. I sought the welfare of the city of Babylon and all its sacred centers. As for the citizens of Babylon, whom he imposed a corvée, right, being imposed servitude, which was not the God's wish and not befitting them, I relieved their weariness and freed them for their service. I freed you, Babylonians. Marduk rejoiced, right? Your God rejoiced over this. Okay, and then what does he say? He says, and then he says, all these sanctuaries and others temples had been abandoned for a long time. I returned the images of the gods who had resided there to their places, and I let them dwell in eternal abodes. I gathered all their inhabitants and returned them to their dwellings. In addition, at the command of Marduk, the great Lord, I settled in their habitations in pleasing abodes the gods of Sumer and Akkad, whom Nabonidus, the Babylonian king, to the anger of the Lord of the gods, had brought into Babylon. Okay, so he says, oh, may all the gods ask daily for my welfare, right? And so here you see actually that he's saying something very similar that he says to the people of Yehudah, of Judah. He's saying, your God told me to let you go home and rebuild your temple. That's what your God told me. I'm serving your God. So you're going to be happy, right? So this is, in fact, we see this kind of framework, we understand that this was something Cyrus was doing. Now, there still is a question. Babylon was important, so we understand why he would write a letter to the Babylonians. Why would he write a letter to this teeny little group in this teeny little country? Why would he care? One of the theories is that there already were Judeans who had important positions at court, and he wanted to make them happy. So we know that there were scribes, and there were Judean scribes around, and we also know from later on with Nehemiah that Nehemiah had achieved a very high position in the Persian court. So perhaps there were Jews in the Persian court that he said, it doesn't, this is what I'm doing anyway. I might as well make a point of it and they probably interceded and said, I will let the Jews go back to their home and rebuild the temple. Any questions before we continue?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Okay. In the case of the New Testament, I know that Bible non-Christian and secular Bible critics have cited things such as nuances in literary style to show that the Gospels were written one way, and then post factum these things are edited to make them look as if Jesus is really being prophetic after the fact. I'm wondering.
No, a lot of the Gospels were written to begin with to try and make it okay. Oh, you mean the temple thing, or what are you referring to?
Yeah, that's the things such as the prophesying the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple and things like that. I'm wondering, have Bible critics attempted, and if so, how successfully, to cite similar evidence here in Yeshayahu and Yirmiyahu, and possibly in Ezra, to show how these texts might have been edited post factum
Okay. So they're all very different questions. So with Yeshayahu, with Isaiah, they simply say the second part was written by someone else in a later period.
We know that, but
connected. Yeah.
No, we know about that the second part of Yeshayahu was it seems like it's been written by a different person at a different period. Even given that, does it seem as if parts of Yeshayahu and Yirmiyahu were edited post factum in order to conform to the historical knowledge later on?
Bible critics do tend to like seeing redactions pretty much everywhere, right? I mean, if there's a verse, like, they will find redactions, like they absolutely, there are different approaches in biblical critics. Like, if you talk about the Copenhagen school, they're going to be talking about less about redactions and saying that everything was written completely late, which is kind of silly. But in general, something like Ezra is very clearly an edited work. In other words, the person who put it together. You can't talk about the book of Ezra without talking about the editing, because it inserts letters. It has Persian letters has Aramaic letters in the book saying, oh, hey, I'm telling you about this thing. Look at these letters that I'm repeating. And the letters sometimes don't really support what the book is trying to say, but it's bringing you the letter in its entirety. So actually you get to judge and say, oh, well, you know what? That letter's from a whole different time period, but they brought it in. In other words, Ezra is very much created as an edited work, right? Where you're supposed to see the seams. In other words, you see where it's brought in, right? You see different pieces that are being brought in. And in general, when you talk about up till this point, the prophecy is accurate. Usually what happens is, in general, when people are studying ancient Near Eastern texts or any ancient text, and they're not coming from a religious point of view, and they want to date the text, they'll be like, okay, what's the point at which the prophecies are true? Well, it must have been written after that, right? So, for example, right, when I learned about the Gospels, there's a very classic thing that dates Mark to after the destruction. Why is Mark dated to after the destruction? Yeah, because Mark's supposed to be the earliest gospel, right? Not like traditionally Matthew, right? Mark's supposed to be the earliest gospel. Mark is dated to after the destruction. Why? Because Jesus prophesied the destruction, right? So the whole book is dated to after the destruction. That's usually
only in Mark?
No, well, the other ones are based on Mark. So all the synoptic gospels, so Mark is supposed to be the earliest one, and then Matthew and Luke take pieces of Mark plus Hugh, and like the whole thing, and their own thing, right? So that's how that works, and that's how things are classically dated. What's interesting is that in our prophecies, we have prophecies that don't come true, and that don't come true kind of in the, like, as I've mentioned with Yirmiyahu and Yechezkel and Jeremiah and Ezekiel. So Yechezkel says Egypt's going to fall to Babylon, Sur and Sidon are going to fall to Babylon, and then they don't, and then he's like, whoops. Right, and we have all those prophecies in the book. So there's an approach as well. Look, they were actually prophecies. This guy was prophesying, and they wrote down all the prophecies. Some came true and some didn't. So that is kind of works against that way of dating. Gershon's been waiting. Gershon.
Yes, hi Miriam. I was reading in the quotes of Koresh. I'm returning all your gods to your houses of worship so they could pray to my God. Was little g. Did he want our God to be restored to his glory so he could then pray to his
Pray for him. No,
God?
not to pray to his God. The way he's talking about the Babylonian gods is he's like, okay, and Marduk is cool with me returning these other idols were like part of his pantheon. So I did that. But Marduk's the important one. Like the Babylonians, Marduk's it, right? So, and he's like, and now Marduk will ask those gods and to pray for me and my sons. That was a traditional thing. And if you look at Ezra and Nehemiah, that's exactly what Darius does. Darius gives money for the temple to finally be built, and he's like, and bring sacrifices for me and my sons, right? That, because cover your bets, right? Just all the gods to pray for me, right? All of the people to pray to all the gods for me and for my son. That's the glory of empire, right? You got an empire with all these different deities, that's how he saw it, right? That's how the Persians worked it. So
Lahavdil, did he think that our God was parallel to his or subordinate to his?
We will never know what his actual religious approach was, right?
Okay.
Because it's. I mean, I think it was a very diplomatic approach where if you said to him, well, who's more important? Which God is more important? The God of the Jews or Marduk? It's going to be depend on who's asking. Like who's asking, and that's what he's going to say. I'm not so sure. Like again, I think he probably is a standard, kind of has a standard polytheistic approach where like any god's good, like you can't hurt kind of thing, But if the way, and I imagine that if he's writing to the Jews, he will say, your God is the God of heaven and earth, right? Because that is what they call him. That's how he's presented. And he's going to say, okay, your God, the same way he's talking about Marduk as being the great Lord, right? So, yes, Ido, I see you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I have two questions. One of them is regarding the 70 years. So I don't see how it works with the pasuk. Like it says, ועבדו הגויים האלה את מלך בבל 70 שנה. והיה כמלות 70 שנה אשקוד על מלך בבל ועל הגוי. Like you cannot count the years after Melech Babel doesn't rule anymore.
Yeah, I hear you. I mean, the thing about the temple is a theory. There's just a certain rush with Haggai and Zechariah where we can't wait any longer. We have to build it now. And they don't say it's the 70 years. And there's a question, why? Why now? Is it just that you suddenly have these two very charismatic, very powerful prophets who can really get it done? And maybe also leaders, because you've got Zerubbabel and you've got Yoshua and you've got these two prophets. And maybe it's just like, this is when you finally have the leadership to get it done. Now, because the question is, what's keeping it back? Now, again, what's keeping it back is also portrayed differently. In Ezra and Nehemiah, it's portrayed that the surrounding nations are keeping them back, are scaring them and not letting them build, which seems to be belied by the letters it tries to quote, which aren't about that at all. According to Haggai, it looks like people are poor. They don't have the money. They don't have the wood. They're barely getting by. And when you're barely getting by, it's kind of hard to build a temple. And that's what it sounds like it is in Haggai. But the question is, okay, so why now is there this big push? It could just be that finally the leadership has consolidated. Like finally you have strong leaders, you have prophetic leadership, you have a priest, and you have a king-like figure that everyone can get behind. And that's the reason. So Malka, you're asking where does Purim fit in here? Esther causes tremendous problems in the chronology. It messed up. Seder Olam Rabbah tried to reconcile the Megillah with Ezra and Nehemiah, and he had to turn cartwheels. He said, okay, so I guess Artaxerxes isn't the name of a king. It just means your majesty. So if it says Artaxerxes, it could be Ahasuerus, it could be Koresh, it could be Darius. The problem is that we know that no, Artaxerxes was a name. So it really messed up Seder Olam Rabbah's chronology. It's very hard to reconcile Megillah. People have tried to do it. It's very, very hard to do. Megillat Esther is very hard to reconcile with the chronology here. I see someone else wrote, Donnie and Libby say, Asher Altshul once gave a share. All about how the number 70 ancient world is just a normal. Yes. So let me say about the number 70, addressing your comment here. In the pshat, the plain meaning of the text, the original, what is the basic meaning of that text in Yirmiyahu? It's using 70 as a typological number. Lots of years. 70 is a lot of nations. It's a lot of languages. It's a lot of years, right? So 70 is a lot of years. So after a lot of years, which is still a finite set amount, this will come to an end. That is what the 70 years is, right? However, as you all know, we don't like to, we like to calculate when is this going to end. And so Jews were calculating when is this going to end. So that's so it seems to have been taken literally, at least to a certain extent. The truth is, again, the Babylonian exile simply didn't last 70 years. Not if we count it from the exile to the allowed return, right? That's not 70 years. But they were like, okay, this is the 70 years, and this is the redemption. So I think actually we've kind of touched on Koresh and his importance, right? And how he's kind of seen as a savior, or simply the person, the king who allows this return to Zion, and certainly as a messenger of God, and as someone who enables the end of the exile. And what we're going to look at in our next class is, do we need a king? Do we have to have a king? Or is this what there is? An officer and an officer within the Persian Empire, and that's fine. Like, how did they see the redemption in terms of, do we need to have a king? Do we need to have someone from the Davidic line? Or no, this is what God promised. What God promised is what we're getting now, a semi-autonomous province in the Persian Empire, right? Which, frankly, in Ezra and Nehemiah, that's the way to go. We're doing just fine. This is what we need to do, and this is what we're going to build within. Right, so we're going to be taking a look at that in the next class. I'm going to put together a list of kind of the topics we're going to be looking at. It's going to be flexible. Yes.
Miriam, what attracted you to this topic?
It was.
I think it's interesting, but what attracted you? Why did you just choose?
To me, what's fascinating is, well, first of all, it's very much what we go through in the modern period, and they went through it in the Return to Zion. And like, is this it? Is this what we want? What is the future going to be? Is this redemption? And just and that we can look at the biblical books and actually see what people were kind of arguing about and had different opinions about. In terms of, what is this supposed to look like? What is God's promise? How much of this is on us, right? And how much of this is supposed to come directly from God? And it's just really fascinating to me, also because we don't look at these books a lot. I feel like we don't read these books a lot. And we don't look at these sections a lot to say, hey, what was Shivat Zion like? And I think it's fascinating. And also I kind of miss Ezra and Nehemiah. It's a really great book. And I think we don't read it. So this is a way I can kind of get back to it. Yes. Well, thank you, everyone.
Miriam,
I'll see you next week.